I caught the singer at the party with my wife. Just as the music stopped, and the guests began to disperse, I saw her. She was there, with him, laughing like she hadn't done with me in a long time. The shock on her face when our eyes met was a direct blow to my heart. It wasn't just the surprise of being caught in the act, there was something deeper, more cruel in that look. It was the reflection of a betrayal that I never imagined could happen. Over the past few months, our marriage had cooled. Conversations diminished, touches became rare, and the distance between us grew. I fooled myself into thinking it was just a phase, a difficult time that we would overcome together. But in that moment, seeing her with him, I realized something much darker was happening. How did I not see the signs? How was I so blind as to not realize that she was seeking in someone else what I could no longer offer? The singer, with his cheap charm and plastic smile, seemed to represent everything I wasn't. That man, who I had hired to bring joy to our party, ended up bringing despair to my life. I don't know if it was the soft sound of his voice that seduced her, or if it was the attention he gave her while I was too busy with my own indifference. But I was sure of one thing, that look of panic on her face, that expression of someone caught in the act, only confirmed what I feared most. Deep down, I wanted to believe that it was just a game, a provocation to make me react, to rekindle the flame that once burned intensely between us. But as I looked at them, I felt the weight of a bitter reality. She had crossed a line that could not be undone. His smile, the way he touched her, everything was real, palpable, undeniable. And now, everything I thought I knew about our relationship was in shambles. But what if I had gotten it all wrong? What if, in that brief moment of panic I saw in his eyes, there was more than just guilt? What if, at the end of it all, this betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg of a secret much deeper and more devastating than I could have imagined? That night changed everything. And as the living room clock ticked relentlessly away each second, the only thing I could think was, what really happened between them? The answer, this damn answer, was about to change my life forever. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't prepared to face it. What really happened at that party? And what will be the true impact of this discovery? Let me tell you. Atlanta was in full spring, with its tree-lined streets and the sweet scent of flowers that filled the air, giving a touch of lightness to the atmosphere. It was a clear and mild night, perfect for celebrations and gatherings. On that particular night, an elegant mansion in the Buckhead neighborhood was preparing for an event that promised to be memorable. Lights hanging from tree branches illuminated the garden where guests began to gather, while soft music filled the space, creating a welcoming atmosphere. The party host, Michael Carter, was a man of striking presence. Tall, athletic and serious-looking, he carried the weight of years dedicated to the success of his technology company. At 38, Michael had achieved everything many dreamed of, a solid career, a luxurious home and a stunning wife that many men envied. However, behind his confident countenance and impeccable appearance, there was a restlessness that had accompanied him recently. The work that once filled him completely now seemed like an empty distraction, a shield to protect himself from the coldness that was beginning to take over his marriage. Emily Carter, his wife, was the epitome of elegance and sophistication. At 34 years old, her natural charm and radiant smile have always been her greatest attractions. She was the soul of every event the couple organized, always paying attention to every detail, ensuring that everyone felt at ease. But that night, something about Emily was different. Behind the impeccable makeup and the blue silk dress that fit her perfectly, there was a gleam of restlessness in her brown eyes. The usual sweetness that emanated from her seemed to have been replaced by a subtle but noticeable tension. In recent months, their marriage had become a pale reflection of what it once was. The long nightly conversations had given way to awkward silences, and the intimate moments were now a distant memory. Emily felt isolated, suffocated by a routine that no longer satisfied her. The passion that had once united them so intensely now seemed extinguished, almost non-existent. Michael, in turn, didn't realize the gravity of what was happening. Wrapped up in his professional responsibilities, he was blind to the loneliness that was silently infiltrating his wife's life. That night, amid the laughter and conversations of the guests, Emily felt disconnected. He watched Michael from afar, admired by everyone, but unable to get close to him emotionally. The distance between them seemed to grow every second, like an abyss that separated them and that no one else could see. She tried to focus on the details of the party, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in confusing and contradictory thoughts. It was then that Lucas Monroe, the singer hired for the night, entered the scene. Lucas was a charismatic artist, with a smooth voice that captivated everyone. At 35 years old, he had a rustic beauty and a relaxed manner that easily attracted those around him. But there was something more about Lucas, an aura of mystery that made him irresistible. Upon seeing him for the first time, Emily felt a spark of curiosity that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the music that attracted her, but the way he looked at her, as if he could see beyond the facade she presented to the world. Lucas started to sing, and his voice seemed to touch Emily's heart directly. The lyrics of the songs, which spoke of love, loss and unfulfilled desires, resonated deeply within her. For the first time in months, she felt something awaken inside her, an emotion that had been forgotten, drowned out by the monotony of her life. While Michael circulated among the guests, completely oblivious to what was happening, Emily approached Lucas, not realizing she was crossing a dangerous line. They talked for a few minutes, and the connection between them was immediate. Lucas was everything Michael wasn't at that moment: attentive, engaging and, above all, interested in her. He made her feel seen, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Lucas's words were soft, but carried with an intensity that made her nervous and excited at the same time. With each sentence, she found herself more involved, closer to that man who seemed to have appeared in her life at the exact moment. As the party continued, Emily couldn't get Lucas out of her mind. Every song he sang seemed destined for her, every look exchanged between them was like a shared secret. She knew she was playing with fire, but a part of her desperately wanted to feel something again, even if it meant risking everything. Michael, on the other hand, remained blind to what was unfolding before him. For him, the party was a success, a way of reaffirming his social position and showing that everything was under control. He believed the distances in their marriage were only temporary, a phase they would overcome together. But that night, while smiles and appearances were maintained, reality was about to show its cruelest face. Lucas, after finishing his presentation, went to the bar to have a drink. Emily followed him, feeling her heart racing. They exchanged a few more words, but what was behind those words was what really mattered. There was a tension between them, an electricity in the air that they both could feel. When Lucas whispered something in her ear, Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. She was on the brink of something she couldn't control, and at that moment, that was all that mattered. Time seemed to slow down as the two discreetly moved away from the prying eyes. They met in a more private corner, away from the guests' eyes and, especially, Michael's eyes. The sound of music drowned out any murmurs, and what was a simple party began to transform into something much darker. Emily knew she was about to cross a line that would change everything. But what she didn't know was that Michael was just a few steps away from discovering the truth. And when his gaze finally met theirs, shock, pain, and anger took over everything. From that moment on, nothing would be the same again. The party that should have been a time of celebration was now the stage for a revelation that could destroy everyone involved. And as the seconds passed, the fates of Michael, Emily and Lucas became inescapably intertwined, leading them to a path of no return. The night was just beginning, and buried secrets were about to surface, with consequences no one could predict. After the initial shock, silence filled the air. Michael stood frozen, watching the scene in front of him as if time had stopped. Emily and Lucas, still close, noticed his presence at the same time. The smile Lucas had on his face slowly disappeared, as Emily took a step back, her face completely devoid of color. That brief moment of fun, of feeling alive, had turned into a nightmare before her husband's eyes. Michael didn't need to say anything. His gaze was enough to convey the mix of emotions that were bubbling inside him: anger, disappointment, disbelief. He turned abruptly and started walking towards the mansion's exit. Each step seemed to echo within him, adding to the weight of what he had just witnessed. Emily tried to follow him, calling his name, but his voice sounded distant, as if he were speaking through glass. Lucas, in turn, remained where he was, caught between what he knew was right and what had led him there. The party continued, oblivious to the turmoil unfolding behind the scenes. The guests laughed, toasted and danced, not realizing that the host had just seen his world fall apart. Michael crossed the room, passing people like a ghost, his mind in another dimension. He walked out the front door, and the cool night air hit him hard, but it didn't bring him the relief he'd hoped for. The distant sound of the music only intensified the feeling of betrayal that burned in his chest. Emily finally managed to reach him, touching his arm to stop him from leaving. When he stopped and turned around, the look in her eyes was one of pure despair. She knew she had gone too far, that the provocation that had initially seemed harmless was now on the verge of destroying everything. Those words that he had rehearsed so much to defend himself seemed to choke in his throat. "Michael, please don't go like that," she said, her voice shaky, barely audible. But he just looked at her with an expression that made her feel even smaller. There were no screams, no public confrontations, just a silence filled with deep pain. Emily found herself overcome with a desperate need to explain, to justify what had happened, but how could she describe a feeling that not even she herself fully understood? "I don't know what you think you saw," she began, but Michael raised his hand, silencing her. "I've seen enough," he replied, his voice firm but restrained. He didn't need explanations, not at that moment. For him, the images spoke for themselves, and each one was burned into his memory with cruel clarity. The silence between them was suffocating. Emily wanted to say more, wanted to beg for a second chance, but Michael was beyond that. The trust, which had been built over the years, seemed to have shattered into 1,000 pieces that night. He pulled away, unable to bear being near her any longer. Emily watched him disappear into the darkness, feeling more alone than ever. Back at the party, Lucas tried to compose himself. He knew that things had gotten out of hand, that the innocent joke Emily had suggested had turned into a serious and dangerous situation. He had always been attracted to Emily, but he never imagined things would turn this way. Now, what started as a simple flirtation had turned into something he didn't know how to fix. Emily, in turn, stood still, looking at the mansion's entrance, waiting for Michael to return, for him to reconsider, for him to say something that indicated there was still hope. But time passed, and he didn't come back. She felt a crushing weight in her chest, a mixture of guilt and regret that left her breathless. That night, the hole in her heart felt bigger than ever, and she realized, with a dawning horror, that she had ruined something that might never be repaired. Michael drove aimlessly, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He wanted to scream, he wanted to find a way to release the pain that was consuming him inside, but at the same time he felt numb. The reality was unbearable. How could he go home, how could he look at Emily again without reliving that scene? He ended up parking the car in an isolated place, away from everything and everyone. The darkness around him matched what he felt inside. He stood there for a long time, trying to understand how things had gotten to this point. When he thought about his life, about the love he once felt for Emily, about the future he imagined for them, everything seemed to have turned to ashes. Meanwhile, Emily returned to the mansion, but the party, once full of life, now seemed cold and empty. She tried to smile at the guests, but it was obvious something was wrong. Lucas approached, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no more flirting, just a mutual understanding that what had happened between them was a mistake that had cost them too much. However, what they didn't know was that the night wasn't over yet. The impact of what had happened was far from resolved, and the consequences of his actions were just beginning to manifest themselves. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, as if she sensed something even bigger was coming. And Michael, alone in his car, began to make a decision that would change all of their lives forever. That night that started as a celebration was about to turn into a complete disaster. And as the hours passed, the path they had taken to that point had no turning back. Fate was sealed, and what was once a spark was about to explode into a flame that no one could put out. Michael spent the night awake. The hours dragged by, and his thoughts revolved around the betrayal he had witnessed. The pain of seeing Emily in another man's arms, of feeling betrayal gnawing at her insides, was unbearable. But as the dawn progressed, his mind began to clear. He needed answers, he needed to understand what had happened to decide what to do next. In the morning, Michael returned home. The silence that enveloped him upon entering was oppressive, as if the room itself was aware of the emotional storm that hung over him. Emily was in the kitchen, her eyes swollen from crying, but she knew she needed to face what came next. Hearing Michael's footsteps, she looked up, trying to gather the courage to deal with the situation. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm but without the coldness of the day before. Michael wasn't a man who liked conflict, but he knew he couldn't run away from it. Emily nodded, feeling her heart beat wildly. They sat at the table, the place that had so often been the scene of pleasant conversations, now became the scene of a definitive discussion. "I know I can't justify what you saw, Michael," she began, her voice low and broken. "But I want you to understand how we got to this point." Michael remained silent, his eyes fixed on hers, waiting for an explanation. Emily took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I was desperate," she continued. "I felt like I was losing you, that our marriage was falling apart. And I didn't know how to reach you, how to make you see that I was still here, that I still needed you." She paused, trying to control her tears. "I never really wanted to cheat on you. In the beginning, it was just a way to tease you, to make you jealous, to arouse you. Lucas was a distraction, someone I thought I could use to make you react." Michael frowned, unable to believe what he was hearing. "So that was it?" he asked, voice thick with disbelief. "Did you pretend to be with another man to provoke me?" Emily nodded, embarrassed. "Yes, but things got out of control. I didn't expect it to go this far. And I ended up getting more involved than I should have. I was needy, Michael. And Lucas gave me the attention I was desperate for, of you." The silence that followed was heavy, as Michael tried to process what he had just heard. He had always known that things between them were bad, but he never imagined that Emily would take such an extreme step to get his attention. The thought that she had become involved with another man, even if at first as a provocation, was difficult to accept. "Do you realize what you've done?" Michael finally said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You destroyed what was left of us because of a game. A dangerous game that you thought you could control, but that ended up being out of your reach." Emily felt a wave of regret wash through her. "I know I made a mistake, and I'm sorry. But please try to understand that I was desperate. I didn't know how else to reach you." Michael shook his head, trying to contain his frustration. "Do you think I didn't realize something was wrong? I knew our marriage was in danger, but I believed we could get through it together without resorting to such extremes." He stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. He paced the kitchen, his hands shaking as he tried to control his rising anger. "And Lucas?" he asked, turning to face her again. "What did he mean to you? Was he just a distraction or something more?" Emily lowered her gaze, unable to bear the intensity of his. "At first, he was just a distraction," she admitted. "But over time, I started to feel something more. I know it only makes things worse, but I don't want to lie to you. I let myself get caught up in him, and that was the biggest mistake of my life." The revelation that she had started to develop feelings for Lucas was like a final blow to Michael. He knew the physical betrayal was painful enough, but the idea that Emily could have fallen in love with another man was devastating. He felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of pain and anger that consumed him inside. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice shaking. I don't know if I can forget what you did, what you felt for him. Emily got up too, crossing the small distance that separated them. Michael, please, I know I hurt you in a terrible way, but I still love you. I never stopped loving you. And I would do anything to make this right, to make things go back to the way they were before. Michael looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, but also knowing that words wouldn't be enough to erase what had happened. I need time, he said finally. Time to think, to process all of this. I can't make a decision right now. Emily nodded, knowing she couldn't ask for more than that. I understand, she replied, her voice low. I just hope that one day you can forgive me. They were silent for a moment, both knowing that the conversation hadn't resolved anything, but that it had at least given Michael the truth he needed. Without another word, he walked away, leaving the kitchen and heading to the bedroom. Emily stood there, alone, feeling the weight of the consequences of her actions. She knew the road to redemption would be long, and that she might never be able to repair the damage she had caused. As Michael isolated himself in his room, his mind was in turmoil. He knew he needed distance to reflect, to understand what he really felt and what he wanted for the future. Emily's words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't shake the image of her with Lucas, the feeling of betrayal that seemed to take root more deeply with each passing moment. But as Michael tried to process everything, another reality was about to surface. What he didn't know was that Lucas was not only a distraction for Emily, but that he also had secrets of his own. And when these secrets were revealed, the true extent of what was at stake would finally be understood, leaving Michael and Emily faced with an impossible choice. Michael, still isolated in his room, tried to find some peace amid the emotional chaos that surrounded him. But peace seemed a distant illusion. He began to recall moments with Emily, from the beginning of their relationship to the point where everything began to fall apart. Every happy memory was now stained with the pain of betrayal, and he wondered if he could ever look at her the same way. Meanwhile, Emily remained in the kitchen, feeling adrift. She knew she had made a serious mistake, but she also knew she couldn't just give up on Michael. He was the love of her life, and she was willing to fight for him, even if it meant facing the darkest parts of herself. It was at that moment that the doorbell rang. Emily was startled by the sound, but quickly went to answer it, hoping that Michael had left the room and was ready to continue the conversation. When she opened the door, however, her heart sank to see Lucas standing there, the tense expression on his face. "Lucas, what are you doing here?" she whispered, looking around to make sure Michael wasn't nearby. "We need to talk," he replied, his voice deep and determined. "I know things got out of hand last night, but there's something you need to know." Emily felt her blood run cold in her veins. "Now is not a good time. Michael is home, and I need to work things out with him." "That's exactly what I'm trying to do," Lucas insisted, walking in uninvited and closing the door behind him. "I didn't come here to cause more trouble, but there's something you don't know, something I should have told you from the beginning." Emily frowned, confused and anxious. "What are you talking about, Lucas? What else could there be?" Lucas took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair as if he was trying to prepare himself for a difficult confession. "Emily, I'm not who you think I am." Emily's mind raced, trying to understand what he meant. "What do you mean? Who are you then?" Lucas hesitated, knowing that the revelation he was about to make would change everything, but also knowing that he could no longer hide the truth. "I'm a private investigator, hired to follow in Michael's footsteps. He was being investigated for involvement in illegal activities. I was paid to find out if he was involved in something dirty." Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "What? What do you mean? Who hired you? Why would Michael be involved in something like that?" "I was hired by one of Michael's partners," Lucas explained, his voice thick with tension. "They suspected he was embezzling company funds, and they paid me to find out the truth. I came into your lives with this mission, but things took a turn I didn't expect." Emily was stunned. So this whole time, you were lying to me? You only got close to me because of work. It wasn't like that, Lucas protested, taking a step toward her. Yes, at first, it was just work. But after I met you, everything changed. I started to really care about you. What happened between us was real, Emily. But I know I was wrong not to tell you since the start. Emily took a step back, feeling betrayed once again. So all this time you were playing with us? With me? With Michael? Lucas shook his head, his expression full of regret. I didn't want things to be like this. I swear. But when I realized I had fallen in love with you, it was too late. I was stuck in a dilemma between work and my feelings. Before Emily could respond, Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had overheard part of the conversation, and his expression was a mix of shock and fury. What's going on here? He demanded, his eyes fixed on Lucas. Lucas turned to face him, knowing the moment of truth had arrived. Michael, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I was hired to investigate you. Your partners thought you were stealing from the company, and I was paid to find out the truth. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. And what did you discover? Lucas hesitated for a moment, but he knew he couldn't hide anything anymore. I didn't find anything illegal. You're innocent, Michael. But I got involved with Emily during the process, and things got out of control. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Michael felt the weight of betrayal, not only from Emily, but also from someone he believed was just an artist hired to liven up a party. The truth was much more complex and painful than he imagined. So while I was trying to save my marriage, you were investigating me? And at the same time, getting involved with my wife? Michael asked, his voice low but filled with suppressed fury. Lucas nodded, unable to find words to justify himself. I have no excuses, Michael. I can only say that things got out of hand, and I'm sorry for all the harm I caused. Michael looked at Emily, who had tears in her eyes, but didn't know what to think. He felt betrayed in every way possible, and the pain was almost unbearable. I don't know how we're going to get out of this, he said finally, his voice thick with sadness. I don't know if we can fix what was destroyed. Emily sobbed, feeling completely broken. I love you, Michael. And I would do anything to make this right, to get things back to normal. But Michael knew things would never be normal again. Lucas's revelation had added a new layer of betrayal to what was already an unbearable situation. And now, he found himself faced with an impossible choice: try to save what was left of his marriage, or abandon everything and start over from scratch. The tension between the three was palpable, and each of them knew their next move could change their lives forever. The climax of the story had arrived, and what was at stake was more than just a relationship. It was the trust, loyalty, and identity of each of them that was at stake. The weight of the silence between the three seemed to crush the environment around them. Michael, still stunned by the revelation, watched Lucas and Emily with an intensity that mixed pain, anger and a deep sense of loss. The words had run out, and the air was filled with an almost unbearable tension. Emily, feeling exposed and vulnerable, kept her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet Michael's gaze any longer. Lucas, in turn, seemed torn between regret and despair. He knew he had crossed an irreversible line, but he was also aware that his presence there only made the situation worse. And yet, something inside him kept him from leaving, as if there was something more he needed to say, something that could, in some way, change the course of this ongoing tragedy. Michael, Lucas began, his voice low but charged with urgency. I know things have reached a point where it seems impossible to fix, but I need you to understand one thing: what happened between Emily and me wasn't just betrayal. It was a mistake, yes, but it was also a symptom of something much bigger, something that had been brewing between you for a long time. Michael glared at him, anger boiling beneath the surface, but there was a part of him that knew Lucas was right. His marriage to Emily, which had once been his greatest source of joy, had turned into a constant struggle, a silent battlefield where neither of them seemed capable of winning. "I'm not trying to justify anything," Lucas continued, the sincerity clear in his voice. "But maybe this could be the start of something new, of a chance for the two of you to look at what really matters and decide if there's still something to fight for." Emily looked up, surprised by Lucas' courage to say those words in the midst of the chaos. She knew he was right, but she also knew that the final decision was not in her hands. The choice belonged to Michael, and only he could decide what came next. Michael was silent for a long time, absorbing Lucas' words. He was faced with a profound moral dilemma. On the one hand, he felt betrayed by those he trusted most, but on the other hand, he knew that the root of that betrayal was rooted in problems that he himself had ignored for a long time. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "You're right, Lucas. This wasn't just about you and Emily. It was about what both of us, Emily and I, pushed aside for so long. But that doesn't change the fact that you both betrayed me in a way that I never imagined it would be possible." Emily, with tears in her eyes, stepped forward, desperate to reach Michael somehow. "Michael, I know there are no excuses for what I did. And I know I can't ask you to forgive me now. But please don't make a decision based solely on today's pain. We built a life together, and I believe that if we can face this, we can emerge stronger." The moral dilemma Michael faced was overwhelming. He could choose the path of revenge, letting anger and resentment guide him, or he could try to forgive, find a way to rebuild what had been destroyed. However, he knew that whatever decision he made would not be easy and that the scars of that day would stay with him forever. "I need time," he said finally, looking at Emily with an unreadable expression. "Time to understand what I really want, to decide if there is still something between us worth saving." Emily nodded, respecting Michael's need to step away. She knew the road to any kind of reconciliation would be long and painful, but she was willing to face it no matter what the cost. Lucas, realizing that his role in this story was ending, took a step back. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice full of regret. "But know that regardless of what happened, I hope you two can find a way to get through this, whether together or apart." Michael didn't respond, and Lucas left quietly, leaving Emily and Michael alone. The void left by his departure seemed to increase the distance between the two, but it also left space for something new to emerge, be it a new beginning or a definitive goodbye. The tension in the air was still palpable, but there was a sense that something was changing. Michael and Emily looked at each other, and for a brief moment, the gulf between them seemed less deep. They knew they were on the threshold of a crucial decision, and that no matter what happened, their lives would never be the same. As silence took over the house, Michael walked away again, needing space to process everything that had happened. He knew that the decision he would make in the coming days would define not only his future, but Emily's as well, and the gravity of that responsibility weighed heavily on him. Time passed slowly, and they both knew they were approaching the point of no return. The moral dilemma Michael faced was not just about whether or not to forgive the betrayal, but about understanding what led him there and how he could prevent the pain of that day from defining the rest of his life. Emily, in turn, knew that whatever decision Michael made, she would have to accept. But deep down, she still had hope. Hope that somehow they could find a way to rebuild what they had lost, to redefine what they meant to each other. As the days went by, both would face their own demons, each struggling with their own truths, until finally the inevitable decision was made, leading them to the outcome of that story of love, betrayal and, perhaps, redemption. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Michael. The decision he knew he would have to make haunted him every moment, a choice that would define the rest of his and Emily's lives. During this time, he isolated himself, avoiding contact with everyone, even Emily, who, in turn, struggled to maintain some hope, although increasingly fragile. As Michael tried to process recent events, he began to reflect on his marriage, the man he had become, and how things had gotten to this point. The painful truth was that he was also responsible for part of what happened, for the disconnection, for the coldness that took over his relationship with Emily. This introspection took him to a place of deep sadness, but also clarity. Finally, a week after the confrontation, Michael made his decision. He headed towards the office where Emily sat, looking more frail than ever. Upon seeing him, she stood up immediately, waiting with her heart in her mouth for what he had to say. "Emily," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I've thought a lot about everything that's happened. I've tried to understand where we went wrong, where things started to fall apart. And the truth is, as much as I want to, I can't. I can see a future for the two of us together." Michael's words were like a blade piercing Emily's heart. She knew this was a possibility, but hearing the confirmation was devastating. "Are you saying, there's no chance for us anymore?" she asked, her voice broken. Michael looked at her sadly, but without hesitation. "I think we both need to move forward, each on our own path. We can't go on like this, stuck in a cycle of pain and regret. I need peace, and I think you do too." Emily felt tears run down her face, but she didn't try to stop them. The pain was unbearable, but she knew Michael was right. What they had was broken beyond repair, and the only thing left was to accept the harsh reality. "I love you, Michael," she said, almost in a whisper. "But I understand that maybe it's best for us to put this behind us. I just wish things had been different." Michael nodded, feeling a huge weight in his heart. "Me too, Emily. But now it's time to move on. I hope you can find happiness again, in a way that isn't tainted by everything that's happened." With those words, Michael walked away, leaving Emily alone with her tears and her memories. He knew the decision he made was the right one, but that didn't make the pain any less intense. But there was a quiet peace in his heart, the feeling that, despite everything, he was finally taking control of his life again. On the other side of the city, Lucas was also facing the consequences of his actions. He had lost not only Emily's trust, but also any chance of regaining what he once dreamed of. The investigation he had been hired to do was over, but he had lost much more than a job. He lost the opportunity to experience a love that, for a brief moment, he believed was possible. Lucas knew there was no future for him and Emily, and he accepted that reality. He left town, determined to start his life over somewhere else, where he could find redemption for his mistakes and perhaps, one day, rebuild his life in a more honest and wholesome way. Deep inside, he carried the hope that by leaving the past behind, he could become a better person, someone worthy of a new beginning. As for Emily, she remained in the house that was once a happy home, now enveloped in a silence that suffocated her. The end of her marriage was a deep wound, a constant reminder of her choices and the consequences they brought. But, over time, she began to accept what happened, to forgive herself and to understand that the future was still uncertain, but it was in her hands. The healing process was long and painful, but Emily eventually found the strength to move forward. She decided to sell the house and start a new life, away from the shadows of her past. Little by little, she rebuilt her life, this time with more wisdom and less illusions, determined never to repeat the same mistakes again. Michael, in turn, found a new form of peace. He also walked away from the life he knew, looking for a fresh start. Although the scars of that experience remained with him, he knew that the future offered new possibilities, and he was willing to embrace them. His decision to leave Emily was difficult but necessary, and he carried it as a reminder that sometimes the path to healing begins with accepting the end. And so, each of them followed their path, marked by what happened, but no longer defined by it. The betrayal, which once threatened to destroy everything, ended up being the catalyst for a profound and inevitable transformation. The future, although uncertain, was open, and it was only a matter of time before life, in all its complexity, brought new challenges and new hopes for them all.